Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. The United States has been more aggressively going after North Korea's illegal cyber activities. The Treasury Department imposed sanctions on a cryptocurrency-related company for helping North Korea's money laundering of stolen cryptocurrencies. This follows the United States government's warning last month that North Korean state-backed hackers are targeting organizations in the blockchain industry. The officials also linked North Korean hackers to the recent theft of $625 million in cryptocurrency. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
The DPRK relies on illicit activity, including cybercrime, to generate revenue for its WMD and ballistic missile program.
In the studio with me is Jason Bartlett, Research Associate for the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at CNAS. He analyzes developments and trends in sanctions policy and evasion tactics, proliferation finance, and cyber-enabled financial crime, with a regional focus on North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. Also joining me is Benjamin Reid, Director of the Cyber Espionage Analysis Team at Mandiant. The team he leads tracks and reports on espionage groups from the countries including China, Russia, and North Korea. Mr. Reid had served as a special assistant at the National Security Council's European Affairs Directorate. Thank you so much for being with us today. Good to have you both in the studio. First of all, the U.S. government has been taking more actions against North Korea's malicious cyber activities. Apparently, North Korea-linked hackers are committing a range of crimes in the cyberspace. Mr. Bartlett, what is the specific area that is most concerning?
So the most concerning specific area that we're seeing right now is related to the financial sector, both traditional financial institutions such as banks and non-traditional financial institutions like cryptocurrency exchanges. In the beginning of North Korea's offensive cyber operations, they mainly targeted South Korean institutions as well as South Korean government agencies. But what we've seen in recent years, especially starting since around 2014, was a major shift towards targeting predominantly financial institutions.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Reid, do you agree with what Mr. Bartlett said? Is there any other area, cybercrime, that North Korea pose really the greatest threat?
So the criminal threat is greatest against the financial industry, and we've seen them move from the focus on traditional banks to cryptocurrencies for a broad range of reasons. But we believe that it has been lucrative for them. You just spoke in the beginning about the $600 million worth of cryptocurrency. And while they definitely still pose a threat for sort of the destructive attacks we saw against Seoul and against Sony, what we see most from them is that financial motivated activity.
I see. So what are the unique characteristics that North Korean hackers display that others don't?
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of technical characteristics that are more common with North Korean actors. They tend to have a lot of code sharing. So there'll be a snippet of one malicious program that then gets reused in another one, and you can track them that way. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the way they operate, the most significant thing is really their sort of a willingness to step across lines that other countries won't. And they've done that with sort of very early destructive attacks, and with the move into these sort of huge heists. They've stepped across lines kind of habitually that other countries have not.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Bartlett, what are the traits that set North Korea-linked hackers apart from other hackers?
I think something to highlight would be what Ben just mentioned about that they're willing to cross lines that many others usually aren't. I think one recent case would be the fact that Seoul recently arrested 2 South Korean citizens for selling military secrets to Pyongyang in exchange for payments in cryptocurrency. And this was the first publicly known case of North Korean hackers not just viewing crypto as a financial asset to steal, but also as an asset to then reward and try to coerce and entice South Korean citizens to betray their country. So I think kind of this integration of cryptocurrency within a wide range of North Korean illicit activities, including espionage and stealing government secrets, is something that North Korea seems to be really focusing more of its resources on.
Mr. Bartlett, North Korea linked hackers are also suspected to be state-sponsored, government-backed. How is it different from an independent hacker?
So the main differentiating factor here is that the Lazarus Group is incredibly well funded and trained by the North Korean government. Many other countries around the world do have their own kind of versions of the Lazarus Group, and there's different varying levels of state sponsorship. But North Korea, from the research that we've been seeing, really invests a massive amount of energy, funds, and resources into training North Korean hackers and putting them in the Lazarus Group, which is the umbrella term. Most of this training seems to have started in even the late 80s, early 90s, and it has continued to evolve throughout the years.
Mr. Reid, what makes a government-backed hackers different from other hackers? And I'm curious, are North Koreans the only hackers that are government-backed, or what about Chinese or Russians?
Sure. So a large amount of countries sponsor sort of cyber espionage teams. And I mean, the US has a program, many Western European countries, Russia, China, Iran, a vast majority of countries do. What sets the North Korean ones apart is that the government-sponsored actors are the ones that are conducting sort of financially motivated operations. There are criminal hackers in the US, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Africa. And so that is a problem everywhere, but really it's the hackers that are state-sponsored conducting the crime that is really unique to North Korea.
So you're saying that North Korea is making these hackers for the financial gains. Is that right?
Yeah, this sort of the Lazarus Group and sort of is kind of the umbrella term that gets used for all North Korean hackers, but the kind of groups that Mandiant tracks within that, they started off conducting espionage, stealing secrets, targeting South Korean entities, targeting defector organizations. But over the past 5 or 6 years, they've increasingly moved into financial motivations. And it started really with a group we track as APT38 doing it, but then we've seen it spread to other groups that started off doing espionage into sort of 2018, 2019. But since then, really everyone coming out of North Korea is doing some sort of financially motivated attacks.
I mean, I wanted to ask this question for our viewers who are not familiar with North Korea's cyber activities. The name Lazarus, where does it come from?
It's a good question. It comes from an email, Lazarus EZ, at Outlook, I think, that was used in the Sony Pictures incident. There's always this challenge in the cybersecurity community if you need to come up with a name and people are, run out of creativity. So it was sort of a straightforward one there. And so it initially referred to just that incident, but over the years it's kind of just become an umbrella term for stuff coming out of North Korea.
So Lazarus is not what they call themselves.
They created that email, so it's possible, but we really don't know.
So Mr. Bartlett, the reason we can say that these hackers are mainly, the behind is mainly Lazarus, is that because the pattern is the same?
So I think it's very similar to what Ben just mentioned, that Lazarus Group is the umbrella term that we use to describe all of North Korea's illicit cyber activity. Allegedly, there are many different subgroups, Blunerov Group and many other kind of possibly spin-off cyber groups that might target different type of institutions, but Lazarus Group is the general term that they do use to classify all North Korean hackers.
Right. And I'm just curious, how can the hackers from such a reclusive country as North Korea can train them so skillfully?
So what we are able to show with research is that North Korea most likely really started to invest national resources in developing some form of an offensive cyber group in the late 80s, most likely 1986 when it created the Medium College or Medium Dahakgyo, which allegedly produces over 100 hackers every year. There was also the creation of a computer science program in Kimchek University, Kim Il-sung University. So there's been a lot of educational investment in computer science, mainly writing codes, and focusing more on software, because what you just mentioned about North Korea being a repressive regime, they don't have access because of sanctions and export controls to advanced technologies, but that's hardware. You don't necessarily need the greatest hardware to conduct hacks, you just need really good programmers and good software, and North Korea has both of those. There also was a lot of help, most likely from China and other state actors that have a history of kind of turning a blind eye to North Korean illicit activity. So there's many other factors, but it's North Korea's ability to kind of uses domestic resources to increase hackers started mainly with educational programs during Kim Jong-il.
So, Mr. Reid, you agree that North Korea has resources to train hackers on themselves?
Yeah, the technical abilities that are needed here are certainly not out of line with a country that has an active nuclear program, that has a lot of, that may not be a sort of an economic dynamo, but has sort of significant educational things. And when you can invest the money and sort of direct things by the state, you can sort of create these capabilities. They're not sort of so advanced that they would be out of reach to a country like North Korea.
Mr. Reid, as you mentioned earlier, North Korea's hacking capabilities were widely known for the first time after North Korean hackers hacked Sony Pictures, right? And that was 2014. And why is the US government putting more efforts to go after North Korea's hackers now?
So I think what you're seeing now is the sort of continued building of a pressure campaign. And it's really, there's been a number of parts of it. Obviously there were big diplomatic movements after the Sony Pictures thing, and that really sort of has continued to build since then. There's been a program from CISA, the US sort of cybersecurity agency, to release North Korean malware to sort of make it more exposed. There's been obviously sanctions that were talked about earlier. And so I think the recent actions from the US government aren't necessarily in sort of a qualitative change from North Korea recently. It's more the continued sort of bureaucratic gears grinding to try to put more pressure and sort of choke off this source of illicit funds.
So, Mr. Bartlett, it's not like North Korea's hacking activities or crypto crimes have been prevalent only recently. It has been really building up, as Mr. Reid said.
Exactly. This has been going on for many, many years, and I think the US is starting to catch up. Unfortunately, with this type of activity, it's usually always catching up because the US has a wide range of not just general national security issues, but even cybersecurity issues that we're focusing on. North Korea's main objective within its cyber operations is to obtain money. For various different reasons. But when you have a long list of US objectives and one objective for North Korea, it's hard. It's hard to keep up.
I'm curious to know how you assess about the US government's response so far about North Korea's cyber activities. So there have been indictment of 2 European men for helping Virgil Griffith. He was sentenced to more than 5 years for attending the crypto conference in Pyongyang. And there were sanctions on crypto-related entities for helping North Korea's laundering the cryptocurrency. What do you think?
So in terms of the indictment, a lot of energy, time, and resources go into drafting those indictments. And the 2 European individuals that you mentioned allegedly have some relation with Virgil Griffith and getting him to Pyongyang in North Korea. There are also many other issues that might have more of an impact in really stopping North Koreans' rapid proliferation of cybercrime. I'm not exactly sure if that indictment itself will have a major impact. It's certainly important signaling. But in terms of the US response, I think what's unique that we're seeing from this administration is not just using sanctions to respond to North Korea. There's been a lot of releases from CISA. There's been more releases from FinCEN as well. And there's also been seemingly a greater interest for more private sector cooperation with the US government. I still think that the majority of the cybersecurity conversation is in relation to Russia and China, not necessarily North Korea. It's still a niche field, mainly because it focuses on the financial sector, but stealing millions or billions of dollars worth of crypto that could possibly go to a nuclear weapons program is a major national security risk. So hopefully there will be a continued increase in U.S. efforts to elevate the North Korean cyber threat to an equal or semi-equivalent level to the Russian cyber threat and the Chinese cyber threat.
Mr. Reid, what's your thought? Like, has the U.S. government responded appropriately so far, or is there more that they can do?
So the U.S. government has really put a lot of effort into it across the various agencies that Jason mentioned. The difficulty with a lot of the cryptocurrency specific stuff is that it's a very dynamic sort of business market. There are startups that go from nothing to billion-dollar valuations in months. And so while there's sort of traditional finance, like the banks have been around, they have relationships with regulators, with cybersecurity, they have a chance to build up that practice. The dynamism in the cryptocurrency market makes that much tougher. So even when either the US or a private sector company like Mandiant sort of knows about something, knowing the right people to call to warn them is more difficult when you have sort of such upheaval in a market. And that's just kind of a feature of where it is. So I know folks are reaching out and people are sort of increasingly aware of this threat because nobody likes to lose millions of dollars. So people are starting to pay attention, but it's just hard.
I mean, the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry, they're by nature, isn't it hard to really regulate those entities or those exchanges because they're pursuing so-called decentralized finance?
The regulation it needs to get figured out. It's something that's new. It's something that really there doesn't fit neatly into a previous regulatory framework. So I know there's a lot of work going on around that, but it's not necessarily impossible because for the moment it still has to interface with the sort of traditional financial industry, and you have kind of mechanisms to do that. But it's just something that takes a lot of development, and because things are changing so quickly, it's hard for government to have everything perfect right away.
Mr. Bartlett, it amazes me because this industry is really burgeoning industry, and it's for normal people, it's really hard to grasp what is going on in that industry. But still, North Korea is able to really take advantage of that. What do you think?
Exactly. So when you have one goal, it's much easier to stick to it. If the one goal is if these intelligence agencies and hacking groups are tasked with the main priority of securing funds for the Kim regime, they will do any means in order to achieve that goal. I think something else adding on what Ben very nicely laid out is that cryptocurrency and the blockchain industry continues to evolve at a rate that regulation just can't keep up with. And North Korea has been following that for several years. So as new technologies develop and evolve, so will new ways to exploit them. And by that, there should also be new ways to regulate them. But it's very, very difficult. I think there's a lot of conversation going on, but it's very important to understand technology before you try to regulate it. So I think there's this knee-jerk reaction of once a new technology comes out, we have to regulate it. I think first it's better to understand how it works, because that's what hackers do. They understand how something works first, and to kind of weigh out the pros and cons of is it worth exploiting. So I think also it would be beneficial to really look at these new technologies and say, well, what do we have that we could apply? What don't we have?
Mr. Reid, does the United States government have capability to catch up with it and then really seriously go after North Korea?
So I think there's obviously a question of capability, but I think part of the issue here is some of the specifics to blockchain technologies, Bitcoin, things like that, and that gets into why North Korea has been going after them. When you look at the Bank of Bangladesh hack, obviously a traditional financial institution, they got $951 million out of the Bank of Bangladesh's account. All but $90 million of that was able to be sort of returned because bank transactions take days to clear. And so they can be reversed if they're caught. And in this case, they were. So there was $90 million that weren't accounted for, and even that had to be laundered. And so the North Korean regime likely only got a fraction of that $90 million.
I see.
When you compare that to cryptocurrencies, the transactions are instant and they're non-reversible by design. So if you're able to compromise an exchange or compromise an individual's wallet and transfer the cryptocurrency out, it's gone, and there's not really a mechanism for sort of regulatory or otherwise, just technologically, there's not a mechanism for returning that. So that's part of the reason we think it's so attractive to these hackers, and part of the sort of built-in, and that's a feature, that's not a bug of these technologies. So it's something that is really going to take a lot of sort of defensive hardening to fix, more than pure sort of know your customer regulation, things like that.
All right. So UN panel of experts are also taking note of this North Korea's cyber activities. And one official has recently said cyber crimes are increasingly becoming a fundamental part of North Korea's sanctions evasion. Mr. Bartlett, how is that so?
So starting around 2014, we saw a major shift in North Korea's MO for its offensive cyber activities targeting financial institutions. There started to be a major shift towards more banks, not just in South Korea, but across the world, Southeast Asia, and then also cryptocurrency exchanges. And this, ironically, or maybe conveniently, occurred during a time when US sanctions really started to rev up on North Korea. So 2014, 2015 was when the Obama administration started to adapt a more aggressive approach towards North Korea in terms of sanctions. There was more adoption of North Korea-related laws from Congress targeting North Korean human rights, as well as other authorities that granted new or enhanced sanction programs on North Korea. So it really seemed to kind of start to occur at a time where North Korea really needed to look for new avenues. Also, 2014, 2016 was when South Korea started to rapidly adopt Bitcoin into its kind of cyber commerce area. So there was a lot of international occurrences happening during this time, and North Koreans are very plugged into international events in terms of where they can exploit for the greatest benefits.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Reid, do you expect to see more North Korean cyber crimes in the future going forward?
It's working for them. So we have every indication that they'll continue to pursue it. And so I think as long as there is a need for, there are significant sanctions and there's a need for currency and cash and things like that, they're going to continue to do what's worked. They have not shown any sort of bashfulness or being any sense of being cowed by international pressure or things like that. So as long as it's working, I think they're going to keep stealing money.
Mm-hmm. Do you think stricter regulations will eventually help curbing North Korean activities?
I think it's definitely necessary. I think, sort of and not necessarily even some combination of regulation and sort of better enforcement and better defense and sort of all of those things to try to squeeze the illicit funds. But especially with the cryptocurrency, with the defensive stuff, North Korea isn't the only group or place out there. There are plenty of criminals throughout the world that are trying to steal cryptocurrencies. They're seeing a number of prominent hacks that have not been linked to North Korea. So I think sort of the continued investment in defense in this space is going to be important regardless of what North Korea does.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Bartlett, the recent sanctions by the United States government on the crypto-related companies, will that send a signal to those companies or entities involved in North Korea's laundering of cryptocurrency?
So the US, as you mentioned, has started to really rev up its economic response to cryptocurrency exchanges. It started about a year and a half ago with new designations on cryptocurrency exchanges. The first one was on a Russia cryptocurrency exchange that was facilitating payments related to ransomware. And then recently, the Treasury sanctioned the Lazaruth Group. So I think there are many other concerns as well regarding cryptocurrency, and I think they will continue to do so. But there also needs to be a strong effort in terms of enforcement, because regulations are only effective if they're enforced. So it's great to create these rules, but if the US doesn't have the mechanisms or doesn't have the support from international partners to enforce them, including cryptocurrency exchanges outside of the US, then the regulations might not have that many teeth to really stop North Korea.
North Korea launched yet another ballistic missile into the sea, marking its 14th round of weapons tests this year. U.S. State Department criticized the action strongly, calling North Korea's recent missile tests an affront to UN sanctions. The State Department said it'll send with U.S. allies a very clear signal to North Korea that these types of provocations won't be tolerated. But whether North Korea will be taking heed of this warning has yet to be seen. Mr. Bartlett and Mr. Reid, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.